Have you ever imagined that a simple treehouse could be the meeting point between the world of the living and the world of the dead? In a small town, Lucas decides to explore an ancient treehouse that hides a dark secret. But what begins as simple curiosity turns into an unspeakable nightmare when he finds himself trapped in an ancient pact. As the shadows bend and come to life, Lucas discovers that the choice he once knew he had no longer exists. Get ready for a horror story that will mess with your mind and leave you wondering, what if? I was in Lucas's shoes. Lucas loved the treehouse, built into a huge oak tree in the woods behind his house. It was his favorite place in the world. Lucas's father had helped him build it the previous summer, assembling a sturdy and comfortable structure. It was the perfect refuge for a 12-year-old boy away from adults, close to nature, where he could dream, play, and imagine adventure stories with his friends. The woods were silent and mysterious, with tall trees that whispered secrets in the wind. But there was something more to the place. Maybe the old house was abandoned, half hidden among the trees. Or maybe the stories the neighbors told about the forest being haunted. Lucas had never believed in ghosts, but he admitted that when the sun went down, the place took on a different air. The shadows stayed longer, the children of the forest grew taller, and the feeling of being alone was more intense. That day, Lucas and his two best friends, Diego and Rafa, decided to explore the treehouse after school. They brought snacks, flashlights, and a deck of cards to play. As they climbed the makeshift wooden ladder, Lucas chose the place for the wedding. "Have any of you been in there?" he said, trying to sound brave. Diego shook his head, frowning. "My grandmother says no one should go near it. They say bad things happen to those who go in there." Rafa laughed, but there was something nervous in his laugh. "It's just an old house. I bet it's full of rats, not ghosts." The conversation soon faded as they played cards and enjoyed the afternoon. The sun was setting slowly, tinting the sky orange and gold, until the light began to fade between the trees. Diego was the first to say it was time to go home. "My mom will freak out if I'm late," he said, putting the letters in his pocket. Rafa, a good-natured man, quickly went down the stairs. Lucas stayed behind, packing up. He liked to spend time alone at home, especially when night fell and the forest fell completely silent. As he packed the remaining snacks into a backpack, something made him stop. A little. It was soft, almost a message, but it seemed close. Lucas looked back, frowning. Maybe it was the wind in the leaves or a small animal in the bushes. But then, it changed again. "Lucas!" He froze. The voice was low, almost indistinct, but clear enough to make his heart race. Lucas looked at the woods, but all he saw were the still trees and the shadows that began to stretch. It must be one of the boys playing a prank, he thought, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. "Very funny, Diego," he said meaningfully. "Quickly go down the steps. You can leave now." But there was no answer. When he reached the ground, Lucas ran in the direction where his friends had disappeared, shouting their names. The woods were dark and the discreet shadows moved. He ran to the porch light of his house, finishing his chest tight. When he entered, Lucas's mother was in the kitchen, finishing dinner. "How was it in the treehouse?" she said, without taking her eyes off the pan. "Cool," Lucas replied, trying to sound casual. He didn't want her to forbid him from going back just because something strange had happened. But that night, as he tried to sleep, Lucas couldn't get the voice out of his head. It was impossible. And even more disturbing was the fact that it was so familiar. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of the woods. In the dream, he was back in the treehouse. But this time, he wasn't alone. The next morning, Lucas agreed with the dream still fresh in his memory. He was in the treehouse again, but everything felt wrong. The branches of the oak tree were longer and thicker, bending as if trying to wrap around him. In the dream, he felt a presence, but he couldn't see anyone. All he could hear was the same soft voice calling his name. "Lucas, come to me." He shook his head, pushing the thought away as he got ready for school. During classes, he tried to forget, but something kept bothering him. That voice seemed familiar, as if he should know who it was, but couldn't place it. During break, Lucas told Diego and Rafa what had happened. "I swear, someone was calling me yesterday," he said, expecting his friends to laugh and give some rational explanation. Diego narrowed his eyes, clearly uncomfortable. "Man, I've heard things in that forest too. Once, when I was with my grandfather, he said the place was too old. Bad things stay in places like that." Rafa snorted, trying to hide his nervousness. "That's better. It must have been the wind. Or, I don't know, his imagination." But Lucas wasn't enhanced. There had been something real about that time. Something he couldn't forget. That afternoon, while his friends avoided the treehouse, Lucas returned alone. The woods seemed darker than usual, even with the sun still high. He climbed the steps slowly, each creak of the wood echoing through the silent place. When he reached the top, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Old engravings carved into the wood, crude drawings, made with what looked like a knife or some other sharp object. Some showed children, others stranger scenes, like hanging figures, objects that might have been skulls. He ran his fingers over the marks, threatening to wear away the wood. "Who did this?" he muttered to himself. As he looked through the records, he could feel the wind blowing through the woods, carrying the sound of rustling leaves. For a moment, everything seemed quiet. Then I heard it again. "Lucas." This time, the voice was clearer, closer. He froze, his heart pounding. It was impossible to ignore. He ran out of the treehouse and looked around, but the woods were empty. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the rustling of leaves. He turned back to the treehouse and saw something that made his skin crawl. A new mark had appeared on the wood, a phrase he knew hadn't been there before. "Don't run away." Lucas felt his legs go weak. He didn't know if he was imagining things or if something really was going on. Against his better judgment, I got up again to take a closer look. He touched the newly engraved words, still fresh, but he didn't see anyone. He quickly climbed down, breathing heavily. On the way back home, I decided I needed to tell his parents, but I knew they probably wouldn't believe him. That night, Lucas went to bed earlier than usual, trying to forget what had happened. But as soon as he turned out the lights, he felt a wave of uneasiness. Looking out the window, he could see the woods. The treehouse looked different in the moonlight, as if something was there. He tried to push the thought away, but sleep was slow to come. When he finally fell asleep, he had the same dream as the night before. This time, however, it was clearer. He was in the treehouse again, but now the carvings in the wood were glowing, as if they were burning with an invisible fire, and the voice called out over and over, each time more urgent. "Lucas, come to me." He woke with a start and a cold sweat. The clock read 300 in the morning. He looked at the window, and it was then that he saw something that made him gasp. A shadow seemed to move among the branches of the oak tree. Lucas threw off the covers and walked to the window. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but when he looked more closely, he realized the shadow wasn't a call. It was something or someone that seemed to be looking right at him. He figured it out by closing the curtains and throwing himself back on the bed. He tried not to think about it, but he knew something was watching him, something coming from the tree house. The next morning came with a gray sky, as if the day itself was heavy with Lucas's thoughts. He felt strange, restless, as if he were being pulled somewhere far away. The treehouse, which had previously seemed like just a place to have fun, now terrified him. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange engravings he had seen up there and the whispering voice that called to him. At school, his friends noticed the difference. Lucas was distracted, almost nervous, and Diego, the most perceptive of them all, finally asked, "Are you okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lucas forced a smile, trying to dispel the fear that was beginning to form inside him. "I just couldn't sleep well." But the truth is that he couldn't get the image of that shadow from the tree branches out of his mind. It stuck in his mind, and he felt a growing need to investigate further. After school, Lucas made a decision. He would go back to the tree house. He needed to understand what was happening, to find out what was really there. Curiosity began to take over him, although a part of him wondered if it wouldn't be better to leave the tree and the forest behind. But it was too late to turn back. When Lucas got home, his parents were in the kitchen, and he took advantage of the moment to sneak out. He grabbed his backpack, put a flashlight and a bottle of water inside, and went out the back door. The forest was denser than he remembered, and the path to the tree house seemed longer, darker. The wind rustled through the leaves, creating a feeling of unease. When he arrived, the tree house was even stranger than before. The shadows were deeper, the branches more twisted. The oak seemed to grow outward from itself, as if it were stretching toward the sky, absorbing something, waiting for something. Lucas hesitated for a moment before climbing, but soon the creaking wooden stairs propelled him forward. He climbed one staircase at a time, anxiety growing in his chest. When he reached the top, he immediately noticed that the house was different. The atmosphere, which had once had a touch of comfort, was now permeated with a sense of oppression. The air was heavy, and the traditional wood carvings that had previously been only around the house were now evidently spread throughout the house. Lucas moved from one of the walls and looked at the drawings. Some were the same as before, but now there were more. On one of the walls, he noticed a familiar figure, a child, with wide, empty eyes, staring directly at him. The face looked distorted, as if it had been carved in a hurry, but there was something about the expression that took his breath away. It was as if the child was alive somehow. Fear took hold of Lucas, but at the same time, something kept him there. Maybe it was the desire to understand, to face what was terrifying him. He took another step forward, and as he did so, something fell beside him, making him jump in fright. It was a piece of wood, a broken board. But the strangest thing was that, as it fell, the sound didn't come from the wood hitting the floor. It came from inside the house, as if something had happened behind the wall. Lucas took a deep breath, approaching the wall, unable to control himself. He pushed the broken board aside, and as he did so, revealed a small hole in the wood. The hole seemed to be recent, and as he looked inside, he saw something that made him freeze. There was an underground chamber. What he saw inside was not just emptiness, but something more, something that seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself were alive. Lucas felt a cold wave run down his spine, and on impulse, he lifted himself off the wall. But as he did so, his eyes fell on one last thing that left him speechless. The wood of the wall, now visible, was more visible, but this time it was words. "Now you know." Lucas's heart raced. He was trapped. Whatever inhabited a treehouse knew he was there, knew he had found it, and, without being able to help it, he felt that something else was coming. Fear and dread took hold of Lucas. He felt an urgent need to get out of there, but a strange sensation prevented him from moving. He looked one last time at the hole in the wall and noticed that the shadows stopped moving, as if they were alive. The air was charged with a growing tension. Lucas knew there was something else in the woods, something darker, and that he wouldn't be able to leave without fully understanding what was happening. He took a step back and then turned back. The voice. Lucas. The air seemed thicker as Lucas climbed down from the treehouse. Each step he took toward the ground was accompanied by a growing sense of oppression. The wind had died down, and the woods, which had once seemed alive, were now plunged into an unsettling silence. The trees no longer swayed. There were no more animal sounds, only the muffled echo of Lucas's own breathing. He stopped for a moment, staring at the treehouse, as if it were watching him. Something was wrong. The hole in the wall, the voice calling out to him. He didn't know what to think, but he knew he couldn't go back. That feeling of being watched had never been so strong. Lucas began to walk faster, his mind racing. He wanted to get out of there, but at the same time, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the house. Something inside him knew he couldn't just escape. He needed to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting what terrified him. As he walked away from the house, a sense of unease washed over his body. The feeling that someone was following him intensified. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing. Even so, fear did not progress. Suddenly, he caught the sound of a twig breaking behind him. It was a clear, crisp sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. He turned abruptly, but the woods were empty. The fear was now palpable, and Lucas no longer knew who to trust. He had begun to think that perhaps he was staying, but the voice, the primitive sounds in the wood, it all seemed too real to be just imagination. Not knowing what to do, he ran toward his house, trying not to shake off the terrifying thoughts. When Lucas got home, his parents were busy with household chores. His mother was cooking dinner, and his father was reading the newspaper in the living room. He didn't say a word. He went upstairs to his room, locked the door, and threw himself on the bed. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want them to know what was happening. But the peace was short-lived. As he tried to clear his mind and force himself to sleep, a shadow appeared in the corner of his room. It was stretching along the wall, as if taking shape. He glanced at the corner, and for a brief moment, thought it was just the light from the lamp projecting something strange. But then he saw it. It was a silhouette, a black outline, shapeless but clearly present. The shadow didn't move, but Lucas felt it watching him. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt tight, soundless. His eyes were fixed on it, and the longer he stared at it, the more it seemed to grow, as if it were slowly but surely getting closer. He felt the weight of its presence, as if he were being swallowed by darkness. The moment the shadow seemed close to touching him, a bright light crossed the room. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, everything was normal. The shadow disappeared, but the fear remained latent in every fiber of his body. He knew it hadn't been a nightmare. Something was in the room with him, something real, and somewhere. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, a truth he didn't want to find out. The next morning, Lucas didn't have the courage to tell his parents about what had happened. The memory of the shadow was still vivid in his mind, but he didn't know how to explain it. Instead of going to school, he decided to go back to the woods, to the treehouse. It was the only way he could understand what was happening, but something inside him was alert. He knew he shouldn't go back. He knew he was putting himself in danger. But the need for answers was stronger. When he reached the woods, everything seemed darker than before. The trees were denser, as if the place was closing in around him. The oak tree, imposing and old, looked different now. Its knees were lower, as if they were bending to touch the ground. Lucas felt a chill as he looked up. He climbed quickly, as if he were running away from something. But when he reached the tree house, he found that fear was gripping him in a different way. There was a pressure in the air, something that made him want to run, but he didn't know where. He looked at the icons on the wall once more. This time, the engravings were no longer fixed in just a few spots. They were all over the house, covering the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and among them, he found a new drawing. This time, it wasn't a child. It was a larger figure, with a distorted face and deep-set, sunken eyes. In the center of the engraving was carved the word choice. Lucas looked at it, and when his eyes moved, something made his stomach turn. The word had moved, not physically, but somehow. It seemed alive, breathing, as if it had taken on a life of its own, invading his mind. He felt a growing pressure, as if the house was about to collapse on him. It was at that moment that he realized he was no longer alone. The environment in the treehouse was changing. As the shadows stretched, the pressure in his chest increased. Lucas could no longer deny that there was something alive in this place. Something dark, something that watched him, controlled him. And he knew he could not escape until he faced what was behind it all. Now he needed to understand the message. Choose. What did that do? The feeling of suffocation continued to grow as Lucas remained in the treehouse. He did not know what was happening there, but one thing was clear. The place was alive. The walls seemed to breathe, and the darkness that enveloped the house was thick, as if it were being fed by something much older and more powerful than he had ever imagined. He looked again at the word carved into the wall, choose. The weight of that word seemed to be more than just an instruction. It was a warning, or maybe a threat. Lucas pushed himself away from the wall, trying to gather his thoughts. The pressure on his chest intensified, as if something was waiting for him to make a decision. Suddenly, he heard a sound coming from below, the sound of something dragging, scratching on the wooden floor. Lucas turned quickly, his heart racing, but there was no one there. The dead silence returned, heavier than before. He felt something waiting for him, like an invisible force watching him. It was then that he saw something even stranger. When he looked at the wall where the word choose was, he saw that something else was happening. The marks began to move. Slowly, the histories rearranged themselves, and Lucas couldn't believe what he was selling. The word choose faded away, and other words began to appear. Go or stay. He took a step back, a chill running down his spine. What was happening here? He no longer had control. Something was forcing him to make a decision. But the decision between what? Leave, or stay and face whatever was waiting for him. Before he could analyze further, a new sensation took over his body. He was no longer alone. There were presences in the woods, watching him. He could feel their eyes fixed on him. Fear took over his mind, and the only thing he wanted was to escape. But something stopped him. Something inside him knew he wouldn't be able to leave, not without facing what was there. Lucas felt a crushing pressure on his chest, as if an invisible force had taken its place. He tried to move, but his legs felt visible and heavy. What was happening? It was as if the house, the woods, and everything around him were closing in on him, making it harder to take each breath. It was at that moment that an image invaded his mind, like a distant memory he had long forgotten. He remembered something his grandfather had told him when he was a child, a a story he had always thought was just a fantasy, a scary tale. But now that memory came flooding back. His grandfather always said that a treehouse was built on an ancient plot of land, a plot of land that had been marked by something terrible, an evil force that had inhabited the woods for centuries. According to him, children would disappear in that region, but they were never found in their bodies. He spoke of an ancient ritual, a pact with evil, something that was adorned but that, from time to time, would awaken to recruit new souls. His grandfather's memory now made sense. A treehouse was not a simple childhood shelter. It had been built over a portal, a meeting point between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And Lucas, without knowing it, had been drawn into it. The sound of a twig breaking brought Lucas back to reality. He looked to the side and saw a shadow moving among the branches of the oak tree. It was a figure floating, without a defined form, but clearly human. Lucas could not understand what it was selling. The figure seemed to distort as it approached him, and the branches of the oak tree bent, as if they were leaning down to receive this entity. With his heart racing, Lucas did not know what to do. He looked for the stairs that would take him back to the ground, but the figure was already in his way, blocking his exit. He could not turn back. It was as if an invisible force had tied him to the spot, preventing any movement. "You have come too far," the voice whispered, coming from the figure. Lucas could not move, the terror or paralysis completely. The shadow seemed to grow, swallowing the afternoon light and taking the form of something more human. Its face was a blur of shadows, but its eyes were there, wide and empty, boring into his soul. "Now is the time to choose," the voice said, clearer than ever. "Will you stay and be a part of us? Or will you run away and never come back?" The question echoed in his mind, but Lucas could not formulate a response. He knew what the shadow wanted. It wanted his soul. It wanted him to make a choice. But he could not. He did not know what to choose. Choice was an illusion. He had never had control. The figure moved even closer, and the pressure in his chest increased. His grandfather's words began to make more sense. The pact was not just with evil. It was with the tree house itself, with the entity that inhabited it. He was trapped, and time was running out. Lucas found himself completely submerged in the shadows of the tree house. The pressure was unbearable, and the figure was getting closer. He felt like his decision had already been made for him. But what would happen when he finally made his choice? The air inside the tree house was thick, and the silence around him was deafening. Lucas felt the presence of the shadowy figure approaching, but he couldn't move. His legs felt heavy, as if something was holding him in place. The oak tree, immense and old, seemed to be breathing along with him, its trunk twisting and its branches bending in a sinister dance, as if it was waiting for the exact moment to swallow Lucas. The figure moved closer, its empty eyes fixed on him. The words echoed in his mind, repeating themselves over and over again. "Will you stay, or will you escape?" It was a choice, but not a real choice. Lucas knew that there was no way out. Even if he managed to escape, something inside him knew that the entity would not leave him alone. It would follow him, like a shadow, until the end of his days. But at the same time, if he stayed, he knew what would happen. He would become part of something greater. He would become part of the very evil that inhabited this place. But perhaps there was no choice anymore. The voice whispered again, soft but filled with palpable malice. "You knew what you would find here. You knew what the house needed." The words echoed in his mind like a muffled scream. He tried to resist, tried to run, but his feet would not move. The oak tree, surrounding the house, seemed to be growing inward, inward, making any movement impossible. His eyes flew open in panic as the air grew heavier and the branches of the tree bent over him, as if preparing to swallow his soul. "Choose," the figure said again, its voice deep and cavernous. Lucas felt the pressure on his chest intensify. He no longer knew what to do. His body was exhausted, his mind in tatters. He was trapped, both physically and spiritually, between the urge to flee and the attempt to surrender. But something inside him, a spark of resistance, still fought. In a final act of desperation, Lucas looked at the wall of the treehouse, where the words "go" or "stay" were still visible, but now distorted, as if the letters themselves were being absorbed by the darkness. He felt as if everything around him was slowly dissolving, as if the house were becoming part of the woods themselves, an extension of the evil that inhabited this place. The oak tree seemed alive now, pulsing with a terrible energy. Lucas closed his eyes, trying to focus his thoughts. He tried to register his grandfather's words, the story about the pact with evil, the cursed ground. He remembered that whenever someone entered the treehouse, they did not leave the same. Those who disappeared in the past were not killed, but transformed, absorbed by the force that inhabited the woods. They became part of something greater, something that could not be understood by mere mortals. Lucas's fear was beginning to turn into something more. It was no longer just dread, but a painful realization. He had not been drawn to a treehouse by chance. He had been chosen. The woods wanted something from him, something he did not yet fully understand. And worst of all, he knew that his choice did not matter. The evil that inhabited this place gave him no real options. He would be consumed, whether he stayed or escaped. With his eyes closed, Lucas finally accepted the truth he had tried to ignore. He no longer had control over what would happen. He felt his mind being invaded by a dark force, something that infiltrated his thoughts, his soul, and took over him. The sensation was physical, as if something was crawling into his body, spreading through his veins. The floor of the treehouse shook. The oak tree shuddered. And then, Lucas felt the hand of the shadowy figure touch his shoulder. It was cold as ice. He could resist no longer. All he could do now was wait for what was to come. The feeling of pain and emptiness took over Lucas, and he could no longer distinguish what was real and what was not. He felt the weight of darkness, the force that consumed him, and a distant voice whispered in his mind, like a promise, "You will be part of us now. There is no going back." The branches of the oak tree wrapped around the treehouse, as if trapping everything inside. Lucas felt his body being absorbed, transformed, as the treehouse and the forest enveloped him. The shadowy figure looked at him one last time, and in its empty eyes, Lucas saw a reflection. He was now part of the place, part of the evil that inhabited it. The forest seemed quieter now, as if it had finally been sated. The treehouse was empty, except for the invisible presence that hovered in the air. Those who visited, like Lucas, would never be the same again. They had become part of the pact, part of the force that waited patiently in the heart of the forest, waiting for its next victim. And as the treehouse stood tall in the middle of the forest, a new figure appeared in the shadows. Her eyes, wide and empty, watched intently. She knew that another soul had been captured. The cycle continues. Evil never rests. The echo of Lucas's story now mingles with so many others. Those who enter the forest never fully leave. The treehouse, built on ancient cursed ground, continues to wait, always attracting new curious visitors. But in the end, all face the same choice. The choice that is no choice at all. The treehouse remains silent, but the evil within it never rests. Lucas, now lost forever in the clutches of the Pact, is yet another soul who becomes part of the darkness that consumes that cursed forest. The dark presence that watched him spreads out, waiting for its next victim, while the house, like a patient predator, silently waits, luring the unwary to its final destination. But the question remains, would you dare to enter? Or would you, like so many other souls before Lucas, succumb to the mystery, to the temptation of discovering the secrets of the Treehouse? This is not the end. Evil does not fade, and it is only beginning to spread. Now you are aware. You are warned. What would you do if you had to make a choice? Comment below what you think would have happened if Lucas had chosen another path. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more horror stories that will challenge your courage and mess with your mind. And remember, the Treehouse is always waiting. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our terrifying videos. Share this story with your friends if you dare, and see who else dares to face the evil that lurks in the shadows.